They had breakfast that morning. This detail appears in 3 separate accounts: the cook's inventory, a letter written 2 days earlier, and the final entry in the expedition logbook. On the morning of October 14, 1896, the 7 members of the Cascade Geological Survey ate oatmeal, dried apples, and coffee at their camp along the Upper Stevens Creek, Washington Territory. The weather was described as fine, with clearing expected. No one suggested breaking camp early. The survey had been in the field for 6 weeks, mapping mineral deposits in the northern Cascades, under contract with the Department of the Interior. The team consisted of 3 geologists, 2 surveyors, a camp assistant, and a guide named Samuel Oakes, who had worked these mountains for 20 years. Their work was nearly complete. According to the expedition plan filed in Seattle, they were scheduled to return to the trailhead at Stehekin by October 20th, 6 days away. The morning of the 14th was devoted to final measurements at a slate outcropping approximately 2 miles east of camp. The work was routine. Dr. Marcus Holbrook, the lead geologist, noted in his field journal that the samples were of moderate interest and that the party could easily finish by midday. There was no mention of weather concern, no notation about the date, nothing to suggest that time was becoming scarce. By late morning, the sky had begun to change. Oakes mentioned it to Holbrook. The response, recorded later by a surviving member, was calm. "We'll watch it." The temperature had dropped, but not severely. It was October, after all. October in the mountains. Everyone knew what that meant, in theory. At 11:40 a.m., according to the surveyor's notes, Oakes made a second observation. He suggested they consider moving lower toward the tree line, where the camp would be more sheltered. Holbrook deferred the decision until the afternoon. The samples were nearly collected. There was no reason, he said, to waste the day. What no one recorded, but what the archives suggest through absence, is that a choice had already been made. Not a decision exactly, more of an agreement to continue doing what they were doing, which felt like no decision at all. By 1:15 p.m., the first snow had begun to fall. It was light, the kind of snow that doesn't accumulate right away, the kind that makes you think you still have time. The team returned to camp at 2:01 p.m. and took lunch. Oakes, according to later testimony, raised the question again. Should they pack and descend now, while the trail was still clear? The decision was postponed until after the meal. In the expedition records, there is a note written in pencil, undated but presumed to be from that afternoon. It reads, "Weather turning but not severe. Will assess at 4 p.m. and determine course." The note is unsigned. It was found folded inside the logbook, which was recovered 4 months later, 11 miles from where the camp had been. At 3:30 p.m., by all surviving accounts, the snow was falling steadily. Visibility was diminishing, but the camp was intact, the gear was dry, and the men were in good spirits. Someone made a joke about fall storms. Someone else suggested hot coffee. There was still daylight. There was still time to decide. The archive contains one final entry from that day, written by Holbrook at approximately 4 p.m. It is brief and matter-of-fact. Snow increasing. Will evaluate conditions at first light. No immediate cause for concern. Beneath that entry, in a different hand, a later investigator wrote in the margin, "They could have turned back." The men had been in the mountains for 41 days. By mid-October, the rhythms of camp life had become familiar, almost comfortable. Every evening, the cook prepared the same rotation of meals. Every morning, the surveyors checked their instruments and consulted the weather. Every night, someone made a fire, and someone else wrote in the log. Routine becomes a kind of armor. It makes the extraordinary feel impossible. In the testimonies gathered afterward, several people noted that the expedition had encountered snow before. Twice in late September, light flurries had dusted the higher ridges and melted by noon. On one occasion, Oakes had recommended a day's delay, and Holbrook had agreed. The storm passed. The work resumed. That experience, small and unremarkable, became a template. Snow was manageable. Snow was temporary. There was also the matter of the schedule. The team had been hired for a fixed term, with a fixed budget. Holbrook had written to the department in early October, assuring them the survey would be completed on time. His reputation, he told a colleague in Seattle, depended on delivering results without excuses. He was not a man inclined toward unnecessary caution. He believed in preparation, in competence, in following the plan. The archive contains a letter Holbrook had written to his wife on October 9th, 5 days before the snow began. In it, he describes the mountains as stern but fair, and expresses confidence in the team's ability to manage whatever weather might come. "Oaks knows this country," he wrote, "and we are well supplied. There is no danger in being prudent and no profit in being fearful." That philosophy, prudence without fear, seems to have shaped every decision made in the days that followed. On the evening of October 14th, after the 4 p.m. entry was made, the men gathered in the main tent for supper. The cook, Thomas Farrow, later testified that the mood was calm. There was some discussion about the snow, but it was speculative, not alarmed. Oakes suggested again that they might consider an early departure the next morning. Holbrook agreed to wake the camp at first light and reassess. The wind picked up around 8 p.m. By 9, it was loud enough that conversation became difficult. Still, no one proposed leaving in the dark. The trail down the valley was narrow and uneven, prone to washouts and deadfall. A night descent, even in good weather, would be risky. In snow, it would be reckless. So they stayed. One of the surveyors, Martin Crew, kept a personal diary separate from the official log. His entry for October 14th reads, "Heavy snow tonight. Oaks uneasy, but Holbrook steady. We are safe here. We'll see what morning brings." The word safe appears 4 times in the surviving documents from that night. By morning, 18 inches of snow had fallen. The storm on the 15th was heavier than expected, but still not catastrophic. The temperature hovered just below freezing. The snow was wet and dense, clinging to the tents and piling against the windward side of the camp. Visibility was poor, perhaps 100 feet, but the camp itself was intact. The men were dry, the supplies were secure, and the stoves were working. At 7 a.m., Holbrook called a meeting. Oakes argued for immediate departure. The snow was deep, he said, but the trail was still passable if they moved quickly. If they waited another day, the window might close. Holbrook asked whether Oakes was certain the trail was passable. Oakes admitted he was not certain. He hadn't scouted it since the snow began. Holbrook suggested they wait until the weather cleared enough to assess conditions properly. 2 men supported Holbrook. 1 supported Oakes. The others deferred to the group. The decision was made to wait. In the investigative report filed the following spring, the Interior Department's examiner noted that this moment, the morning of October 15th, represented the last clear opportunity to descend safely. But the examiner also acknowledged that the decision to stay was not unreasonable given the information available at the time. The men were experienced. The camp was stable. The storm, by all appearances, was finite. They spent the 15th reinforcing the tents, inventorying supplies, and waiting for a break in the weather. Crew wrote, "Snowed all day, morale fair, Oakes anxious but Holbrook confident. We have food for 3 weeks if necessary. No one believes it will come to that." That night, the temperature dropped. By the morning of October 16th, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained overcast. The accumulation was now above 2 feet in the open areas, deeper in the drifts. Holbrook sent Oakes and one of the surveyors to scout the trail. They returned after 2 hours and reported that the upper section was still navigable, but slow going. The lower section, where the trail descended through dense timber, was blocked in places by fallen branches weighted down with snow. Oakes recommended they pack immediately and attempt the descent. Holbrook asked if the trail was safe. Oakes said it was passable, but not safe, not in the sense of being free from risk. There was a difference, he explained, between a trail you could use and a trail you should use. Holbrook chose to interpret this as uncertainty. He proposed waiting 1 more day. If the weather held, the snow would settle, the trail would clear slightly, and they could move with less risk. The logic was sound. The problem was that the logic assumed the weather would hold. It did not. On the night of October 16th, the second storm arrived. The second storm was not a blizzard. It did not announce itself with violence or spectacle. It began as a thickening of the air, a return of the snow that had paused for a day, a quiet resumption of what had already started. By dawn on October 17th, another foot had fallen. The expedition log for that day is brief. Holbrook wrote, "Conditions deteriorating, movement inadvisable, supplies adequate, morale steady." But crew's diary tells a different story. His entry for the 17th reads, "We are stuck. Oakes says the trail is gone. Holbrook says we wait for clearing. I no longer know who is right. The cold is worse than the snow." The cold had become the more serious problem. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s, and the wet snow from earlier in the week had begun to freeze into a hard crust. The tents, which had been adequate in September, were not designed for prolonged winter conditions. The stoves kept the interior spaces barely tolerable, but fuel was becoming a concern. Oakes calculated that they had enough cut wood for perhaps 5 more days, assuming they rationed carefully. On the 18th, Holbrook ordered the team to begin conserving fuel. Fires were allowed only for cooking and for 2 hours in the evening. The men wore every layer they had. Crew noted that his fingers were numb by mid-morning and did not warm fully until nightfall. The snow continued. By October 19th, the accumulation had reached 4 feet in the meadow where the camp was situated. The tents were half buried. The trail, according to Oakes, was now impassable without snowshoes, and the expedition had not brought snowshoes because the survey was supposed to be completed before heavy snow arrived. Holbrook made a notation in the log. "Weather unrelenting, awaiting break to attempt descent. All members in fair health." The phrase "fair health" was an optimism. Farrow, the cook, had developed a persistent cough. One of the surveyors had frostbite on 3 fingers. Another was complaining of headaches and nausea. Symptoms that Oakes suspected were early signs of altitude sickness, though the camp was not particularly high. On the 20th, the day they were supposed to have returned to Stehekin, the storm finally paused. The sky did not clear, but the snow stopped. Holbrook called another meeting. Oakes was direct. They had to leave immediately, he said, even if it meant abandoning the heavier equipment. The snow was deep, but it was not yet impossible. If they waited for perfect conditions, those conditions might never come. Winter, he reminded them, was not a negotiation. Holbrook asked the group for opinions. The responses were mixed. 2 men agreed with Oakes. 2 wanted to wait for the sky to clear. 1 said he would follow whatever the group decided. Holbrook himself was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "We'll give it 1 more day. If the weather holds, we'll have better visibility and a safer descent." Oakes did not argue further. In later testimony, he said only, "I thought we had already waited too long, but I was not in command." That night, the 3rd storm began. By October 22nd, the situation had moved past difficult and into something closer to desperate, though no one used that word. The snow was now over 5 feet deep. The tents were completely buried except for the stovepipe vents. The men had stopped going outside except to gather firewood, and even that had become dangerous. One of the surveyors had fallen into a drift and had to be pulled out by 2 others. The food supply, which had seemed adequate a week earlier, was now being rationed carefully. Farrow estimated they had enough for another 10 days, perhaps 12 if they stretched it. But fuel was the more immediate concern. The woodpile was nearly gone, and cutting more was almost impossible in the deep snow. Holbrook's log entries had become sparse. On the 22nd, he wrote only, "Storm continues. No movement possible." Crew's diary, by contrast, had become a record of small failures. Farrow's cough worse. Holbrook silent most of the day. Oakes made snowshoes from tent canvas and willow branches. He says he will try the trail alone if the weather clears. I do not think it will clear. On October 23rd, Oakes did attempt to scout the trail. He left camp at first light and returned 3 hours later, exhausted. He reported that he had made it less than half a mile before the snow became too deep to continue, even with the improvised snowshoes. The trail was gone. The landmarks were buried. He said he could not be certain of the route, even if the snow stopped. For the first time, Holbrook did not write in the log that night. The next entry, dated October 25th, was written by crew. It reads, "Holbrook ill, fever and confusion. Oakes has taken charge. We are burning furniture to stay warm." On October 27th, Farrow wrote, "No more wood. We are cold all the time now. Oakes says we have to try to walk out, but I don't think we can." Holbrook does not speak. The final entry in the expedition log is dated October 29th, 1896. It was written by Oakes in pencil in handwriting that is notably unsteady. It reads, "Attempt descent tomorrow if able. God help us." There are no entries after that. The first search party reached the area on March 12, 1897, nearly 5 months after the expedition's scheduled return. The snow had begun to melt, but the high country was still difficult to access. The searchers found the camp on March 18th. The tents were collapsed under the weight of snow and ice. Inside, they found the remains of 4 men, including Dr. Marcus Holbrook. The bodies were arranged in a way that suggested they had died in their sleep, though the exact cause of death could not be determined. The medical examiner's report listed hypothermia as the most likely explanation, possibly complicated by malnutrition and illness. 3 men were not in the camp. Their bodies were found over the following weeks, scattered along what would have been the descent route. The farthest was located 11 miles from the camp, in a ravine near the tree line. The man was identified as Samuel Oakes. He was found with the expedition logbook in his coat pocket. The Interior Department launched an investigation. The examining officer reviewed all available records, interviewed family members, and consulted with other guides familiar with the region. His report, filed in June 1897, concluded that the deaths were the result of adverse weather conditions and a series of delayed decisions that, while individually reasonable, cumulatively proved fatal. The report identified October 15th as the critical juncture, the last morning when descent was clearly possible. But the examiner stopped short of assigning blame. Dr. Holbrook, the report states, was an experienced and cautious leader. His decisions were consistent with standard practices for expedition management. The storm that followed was of unusual severity and duration, beyond what could have been reasonably anticipated. Still, the report included testimony from other guides who had worked the Cascades. One, a man named Elias Tripp, said, "Sam Oakes knew those mountains. If he said it was time to go, it was time to go. Waiting for certainty in the high country is a mistake. Certainty doesn't come." Another guide, interviewed separately, put it more bluntly. They treated October like it was still September. That's what killed them. In the months following the recovery, several of the victims' families requested further investigation. Holbrook's widow, in particular, wanted to understand why her husband had not ordered an earlier retreat. The department assigned a second examiner, who reviewed the case in detail and reached the same conclusion. The decisions made were defensible at the time they were made, but the examiner's private correspondence, discovered years later in a separate archive, reveals a more personal judgment. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "The tragedy is not that Holbrook made a bad decision. The tragedy is that he kept making the same decision, to wait, to assess, to defer, until the choice was no longer his to make. He was not reckless. He was simply late." The letter continues, "I have seen this pattern before. Men of intelligence and experience, trained to value deliberation, caught in situations where deliberation is the one thing they cannot afford. They wait for the right moment, and the right moment passes, and they wait a little longer because they cannot believe the moment is truly gone. And then it is too late, and the waiting itself becomes the mistake." The department did not include this letter in the official file. The families received compensation. The geologists' findings were compiled and published posthumously. The maps were completed using the survey data recovered from the camp. A small memorial was erected in Seattle, listing the names of the 7 men. The inscription reads, "Lost in service to knowledge, October 1896. What the memorial does not say is that the men were not lost in a sudden disaster. They were lost across 2 weeks of incremental choices, each one small, each one understandable, each one a little too late. In the final report, the examiner included a section titled Recommendations for Future Expeditions. Among the suggestions, leaders should establish weather contingencies in advance and adhere to them without exception. The decision to retreat should be made on schedule, not on conditions. Waiting for perfect information is a form of risk. He also wrote, "It is a peculiarity of human judgment that we feel safer when we are doing nothing, even when doing nothing is the most dangerous choice available." The report was filed, and as far as the archives show, never referenced again. The case of the Cascade Geological Survey is not in itself unusual. The archives of the late 19th and early 20th centuries contain dozens of similar incidents. Expeditions that waited too long, groups that misjudged the weather, parties that disappeared in conditions that were harsh but not extraordinary. What distinguishes this case is the clarity of the record. We know almost exactly when the opportunity for escape closed. We know what was said, what was written, what was decided. And we know that nothing dramatic happened. There was no avalanche, no sudden whiteout, no catastrophic failure of equipment or judgment. The men did not panic. They did not quarrel. They did not abandon their responsibilities or lose their discipline. They simply waited, in a reasonable and orderly way, until waiting was no longer survivable. The question that remains, unanswerable perhaps but worth asking, is whether Holbrook knew, whether at some point during those 2 weeks he understood that the moment had passed, whether he recognized that his careful, deliberate approach had become the problem. We have no evidence that he did. His final entries are calm, even bureaucratic. He recorded facts, noted conditions, maintained the log. If he experienced doubt or regret, he did not write it down. But Oakes knew. That much is clear. He argued for departure on the 15th, again on the 16th, and likely on other days for which we have no record. He built snowshoes from canvas. He tried to scout the trail alone. And in the end, he tried to walk out, knowing it was almost certainly hopeless. His body was found farther from camp than anyone else's. The historian who compiled the final archival report on the expedition, writing in 1934, nearly 40 years after the event, concluded with a brief reflection. He noted that the case had become something of a cautionary tale in certain circles, mountaineers, expedition planners, wilderness guides, but that the lesson was often misunderstood. The lesson, he wrote, is not that caution is dangerous. Caution is essential. The lesson is that caution, when it becomes an excuse for inaction, ceases to be caution and becomes merely delay. And delay, in certain circumstances, is indistinguishable from a death sentence. He added, "We imagine that tragedies announce themselves with noise and fire, that danger is always unmistakable, that we will know when the crisis has arrived. But the truth, as the Cascade expedition demonstrates, is that the crisis often arrives quietly, in the form of a question deferred, a decision postponed, a voice ignored. And by the time we realize we have waited too long, the waiting is already over." The report was published in a regional history journal and was read by almost no one. Today, the site of the camp is accessible only to experienced mountaineers, and even then, only in summer. The trail the expedition was supposed to descend is no longer maintained. The meadow where they waited is still there, unmarked except by the shape of the land. In the archives, the documents are filed in a box labeled Geological Surveys, 1890-1900. The logbook, crew's diary, Holbrook's letters, and Oakes's final note are preserved in acid-free folders. The handwriting has faded slightly, but the words remain legible. On the last page of the logbook, beneath Oakes's final entry, someone, perhaps one of the searchers, perhaps the examiner, perhaps a later archivist, added a single line in pen. It is not dated and not signed. It reads, "They had time. They thought they had time."